So welcome to our fifth meeting now on the Better Work Together book club. We're only 3 people so far. Maybe somebody else will show up. So this time we read, let me just check. Yeah, our unnumbered essays, just resources and reflections. Yeah, does anybody want to start on something? Any comments? We have some notes in the document. I see they're both from you, yeah.
Yes, sorry. I was just trying to look at the first part there.
This Chesterton fence, was this like you shouldn't take down a fence if you don't know what it's there for?
Yeah, sorry. What I meant was I was trying to look at the first part that had no notes, the 5-step journey part, just to see like if there was anything I wanted to talk to about that. I did actually find that quite useful, but I didn't really have much to say about it. So yeah, the sharing power, money and information section had a sort of section where they don't reference it by name, but they reference Chesterton's fence, and that is the concept by the author G.K. Chesterton that you if you see a fence that you think shouldn't be there because you don't see any reason for it being there, you shouldn't take it down. Whereas if you know why it is there, then you can take it down, if that makes sense. So like, if you think that there is no reason for something existing, you're probably wrong, and you probably don't know what the reason is. Whereas if you know what the reason is, then you have a much better case to like remove it. And I think in their descriptions, like of what they did learn a lot about what they were doing. So they were like learning about like how companies are structured and things like that in the process of like breaking them. I don't see it as like necessarily counter to that example at all, but it is a thing I think about a lot, and like to take it to my day job, especially because GitLab is, I mean, it's not super old software, but it does have a lot of stuff that was contributed that nobody remembers why it was there. And then it's quite hard to and possibly Git is the same, Thomas, where like, you know, you're like, there probably was a reason for this, but I don't know what it is, and until I know what it is, like I don't feel comfortable like changing it. So yeah, I always think that's an interesting thing. Also,
would you know what was the original like metaphor that he used it for? Would Chesterton, was he just talking about fences in general, or did he have like cows in them or something?
I think it was about social reform. Like, you know, if you're you know, the fence is like a metaphor even in the original sort of example, but like, you know, it might be like, you know, we should get rid of this legislation, or we should get rid of this way that society works because there is, I don't see a reason for it to be there, which is sort of the fence in the analogy, I guess. So I think yeah, I certainly know people, I've certainly been that person in the past where I've been like, you know, this is dumb, like why do we ever have this, like we should get rid of it, which is normally an indication that I just don't know enough about what I'm talking about.
They also mentioned like sometimes they end up putting up the fence again or using the thing they didn't want to use anyway, but in the process they learned a lot about it, why it was there and why it works well the way it does. And I guess it's exactly the same in software development. Like if you question something, somebody will tell you why it's there sometimes. Or you remove it and then everything breaks and then you know why it was there.
Or you'll like reinvent the wheel, to use a different analogy, right? Like you'll say like, you know, I don't get why we have this, and then you'll end up coming up with pretty much the same thing like independently. And I think that happens quite a lot. But the way they described it in the chapter, I thought like was interesting, because like they were talking about like, you know, using this as a learning experience. Like, I don't think it's necessarily bad if you remove something that you don't understand how it works in order to understand how it works. Like, I think that's also valid. So yeah, it was interesting to me because that's an analogy I like a lot.
I think it's good learning to remove the fences. I do it in Gitter, I do it all the time, and most of the times it comes back to me and I'll put the fence right back in after little production outage, but I'll learn a lot doing that. One thing I definitely learned was to read the comments before I pronounce that something's dumb, and I'll remove it just by looking at the production code itself. I read the lengthy comments explaining why is it there.
Or when the comment was missing and you add it back, you add a comment for the next person so they know why it's there, or it's back over there. Right? And they also mentioned like taking things apart and seeing how they work and putting them together again, which to me is like the definition of hacking, basically. Like playing with stuff.
It's a really interesting concept with like social sciences, right? It's really, for us, it's really easy to understand when we are talking about software, but once you start talking about people and like trying to remove social norms or corporate norms that are most prevalent in society, that sounds really daunting to me.
I guess it's definitely a slower process because people will still think in the old way without maybe even realizing, or they're just more reluctant to change in general.
Yeah, and I think like, you know, there's definitely a cultural context to this as well, because like I come from a country that's from the UK, which up until sort of fairly recent events was like the big emphasis was on stability. Like, we have no written constitution or anything like that, for instance. Like, we tend to do things like, you know, we tend to like accrue procedure over time rather than like, you know, have a clean slate and do it. So like it's sort of, and GKHS system was British as well, I think. So I think that lines up too in my mindset. Whereas other countries might have different, not other countries, other cultures might have different approaches.
But yeah, with laws in general, like they tend to just add up, like you just usually add more laws rather than refactoring basically the existing laws.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Probably also because the other laws have like, they have a certain reason why they're there, and it's sometimes I guess easier to just add more exceptions and special clauses.
Cool. Yeah, no, I agree. Like, I think, and I think that's partly because it is harder to remove a law than it is to add a law. Like, you know, in the same way that like, you know, we like to move quickly with how we do things, and we also need to add checks to make sure that like, you know, quality is high and like, you know, the user experience is good and the documentation is good and that it's performance and everything else. But it's very hard to remove one of those checks because like everybody's going to say, well, what, you don't care about quality anymore? So it's like a very difficult conversation to have to go in the other direction. Like, adding things is much easier than removing things, and I think that applies to product stuff as well, right? Like, you know, when you're considering like removing a feature from a product is sort of famously painful thing to do, because like you will get a bunch of people who you had no idea were relying on this who say like, you know, this completely broke my workflow, etc., etc. Whereas adding a feature can be negative because it might slow things down, it might make the product less coherent overall, etc., etc., but is very like unlikely to have that like, you know, you broke everything reaction.
One thing I found interesting in that sharing power, money, and information, there was was it there? No, that was the next one. Sorry for that. But one thing that they said in this article was, or reflection, was that doing the online decisions and a lot of the hard, I don't know, summarizing and everything online frees up more time for social interactions. I found that really interesting. We don't, at GitLab, we have a little bit more extreme environment when we see each other once every 10 months. I guess it doesn't apply that much to us, but it makes sense even for smaller communities that are meeting each other once a month or something. If you do all the research and debate online, you can just then talk about your kids and holidays. You don't have to talk about whether you want to pass this new directive or something like that.
And I think this is also mentioned in other parts of the book, that making the decisions asynchronously is just usually more efficient, because some people need time to think about it before they can give their opinion. And it just gives everybody a more equal voice, I guess. And it's not always the best use of meeting time to like try to get a decision right now.
Yeah, I find that interesting because like they did say that meetings are still used for making decisions, but they said that most decisions are async. And I think there are some decisions where it's more valuable to make them in that sort of high bandwidth context, and a lot of decisions, probably most decisions, where it makes more sense to do them asynchronously. And the other thing about doing things asynchronously is not so much at GitLab, because like we don't do things that way, but certainly in previous jobs, like, you know, I've been to things where you go into a meeting and you're like, right, we're going to decide what we're going to do here. And we say, you know, you come out of the meeting and you feel like you've decided what you're going to do. And then like a week later, it turns out like everybody understood something different from that meeting, or like, you know, 3 people have changed their minds. Like I've changed my mind. Like, you know, I've realized it's a bad idea, because like, you know, in the synchronous context, you don't have much time to like think about what might not be the best way of, you know, whether it's the best way or not. Whereas asynchronous, you can take more time, you can consider what other people have said, you can refer back to what other people have said. I find really valuable as well. Like, you know, I find it useful to sort of like quote people and sort of read like exactly what they said, not what I thought they said. But in a conversation, like it just tends to go into what I thought they said. So I find that part really valuable. But yeah, I'm just going to have a look and see if they mentioned which decisions they use the meetings for, because I do remember that from the...
Yeah, they mentioned something about, I mean, like having the discussions asynchronously and then maybe the decision at the meeting, or the other way around, maybe. But yeah, also like, because they discuss online on Loomio, like everybody has the context and has read everything when they come to meetings, so everybody can, like, they can have a vote quickly and don't have to have a long discussion again or something like that.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I'm
I think
not...
this was also in an earlier essay or something.
Yeah, I'm not having much
One
luck
thing
finding
in
it.
that coffee, beer, and pizza was that like kind of when they had to make the initial draft of the restructure of Enspiral, they were kind of small group, and maybe they were co-located. That's the only part that I remember. That was like only a few people and probably really high bandwidth in one place.
I did think, I was saying to Marcus just before the recording started that like partly because of the nature of the book, there are definitely sections that, you know, because it's written by a bunch of different authors, right? Like there are sections where I'm reading them and I'm like, this doesn't really do anything for me. And then there are sections where I'm like, oh, this you know, this really resonates with me. And obviously those will be different for different people, but I did find these 2 sections, sharing power, money, and information, and then coffee, beer, and pizza, to be really good. And I also thought they related to each other quite a lot. Like there was a lot that sort of was in common between the 2. So yeah.
And I was also saying, like, the first resource, the unfolding purpose, it's more like a group exercise basically. So it's not that much fun reading it, but doing it would probably be interesting. And I was wondering if maybe we could do it in the book club group, but I'm not sure if that would make sense. It would probably be more make more sense in a team or something, like with the group of people that actually working together.
It seems like it was very focused on personal purpose as well. And for me, there was definitely too many questions for it to be easy read. You know, if you have questions like, what's your purpose in life? I definitely would want to like go with a notebook for an hour and kind of think about it rather than just skim through it. So that's why I have it in my to-do list, some of the questions to think about them deeper, but I didn't have enough time to.
I can't remember if it was that chapter, but I think there was a chapter that mentioned, and I think it might have been that chapter that mentioned like people tend to make those changes after they've had a break from their normal routine. And I think that's exactly why, is because like when you get out of your typical context, you have the chance to reflect on things like that and think more deeply about things like that. Whereas when you're in the day-to-day grind of whatever your day-to-day grind is, it's hard to sort of step outside of that and think longer term.
Yeah, I think this would make sense in a retreat or like contribute like context, where everybody's like in a special place away from the daily business.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why companies have things like retreats and offsite things. Like even, you know, we have offsites, which is kind of a weird name because like everybody's offsite, but you know, like that's why companies do things like that, right? Is to like, you know, try and create that break. One thing sorry, go on. I was just gonna say one thing. There you go.
I was just wanting to say, like in private life, that's probably why people like to go on vacation, just to get away from it all and just get inspiration about their life and purpose and things like that. Yeah, but go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna like call out something that I mentioned in the doc, but I didn't actually mention in the call yet, which was that in a previous call, I think the first or second one we had, Charlie mentioned about the bucket system for like how Enspiral budgeting works, where like, you know, it all goes into a central account and then you pay yourself out of the Enspiral account, and then you can put out buckets for projects that you want, like almost like Kickstarter for people to fund. You know, and it's quite friction free because like it's not like you have to take money out of your actual bank account. It's before it would even go into your actual bank account. Yeah, it was described in the book pretty much exactly as Charlie described it before, which makes sense. But it was interesting to see it written out. I was like, hey, I know this.
I also like how I also liked how they described this like as a different decision-making method, because you don't need consensus from everybody. You just need enough support to have your funding, and then you can do whatever you were going to do.
There was a nice drawing in the book that was kind of showing where the money flows. It was very raw, and I liked it.
Yeah, it was fun, wasn't it?
Yeah, the last comment I've got on these articles was, I think I liked Coffee, Beer and Pizza the most, just because it was really relatable. Like I could understand everything that was said. Sometimes the articles are really abstract, but this one was like I could understand why the restructure needed to happen and what were the main pitfalls. And I could understand that one of the hardest thing, even they mentioned it in the author mentioned it in an article, that like deciding what is not part of the core Enspiral foundation was one of the crucial parts. And I think that like that had to be a really tough discussion. And it's like that always, like taking, as we mentioned just then, taking things out is harder than putting them back in. So that kudos to them that they managed to get to like 3 support functions that they agreed on, and the rest of them they outscoped.
And I guess another point to that is they didn't decide not to do them anymore, but just not define them as a core function. So I guess everybody who still wanted that was then responsible for making it happen, I guess. Yeah.
You are muted, Sean, if you are saying something.
So I am. I was just saying, like you said, Thomas, there's like all these deep questions in the Finding the Stuff That Matters essay. But even in the reflections that we were talking about, they were sort of talking about you know, they did have quite a long list of questions for like, how do we get to the thing that we want to get to? And often when people ask those, I find it frustrating, but that's typically, I think, because I have a lot of the context in my head already, and it's good they're asking them because they want to get the context like out of people's heads and into the conversation. The book Crucial Conversations, which is a really good book, I'd recommend it, mentions, like, I think it's the shared pool of knowledge or the shared pool of meaning as like an important thing in a conversation where the stakes are high. So like just stating things that you know or that you believe, even if you don't expect other people to agree with them or agree with the importance of them, just to get people understanding like the basis for what you're thinking is very useful. And I think that's why those are useful, and especially for a super important decision like they were, or super important process like they were doing here. So yeah.
Crucial Conversations are on my to-do list. Everybody at GitLab is raving about it. So it's one of the next books I'm going to read.
It's very good. Actually, I was going to bring it to contribute. I started an issue to swap books. So if you want a copy, I can just give you a copy at contribute if you comment on the issue.
Sounds good.
He also mentioned something like when you talk to other and describe your views or something like, then others can point out like what your assumptions are that you didn't even realize that you had. And also they can tell you if it sounds authentic. Like if you sound convinced of your opinions or something like that. Which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. And also even if like the whole rubber ducking thing, right? Like even if nobody else is actually like responding to what you say, just the act of you trying to explain like what you think is useful to you to understand, like if you understand your thinking as well as you think you do, right? Like because there's the whole thing about like you don't understand something unless you can explain it to somebody else. So I think that's a valuable part of that as well, like even when it's about sort of something that's a bit more reflective than, you know, maybe a technical topic or whatever.
Or even just like trying to put it into a coherent sentence, because sometimes you don't really think like that. Like sometimes it's more fuzzy and more non-verbal. And then when you have to explain it to somebody, you actually have to find the right words and explain it logically, I guess. They can help, like, they can help yourself understand how you actually think about it.
Like brain, one of the really good functions of brain is just making you think that you know or what happened, or like convincing you that you are in control. Like this is, you definitely know the split brain phenomena, right? When you use sedate people's brain because of epileptic seizures, and then like the brain that can talk tries to explain always what the hand that's controlled by the other half of the brain does. So like you reach for the glass of water because you like the creative, I think it's the right hemisphere. So a picture of glass of water, so you reach with the other hand, and then the verbal part starts to explaining it like if it had all the reasons. And we do it all the time. And with the books, you notice it really clearly. Like you think you know everything till you try to say a sentence to your friend, and then you figure out you know nothing.
I guess we're running out of things to talk about because we're so few people today. Yeah, if you want, we could stop here or chat a bit more. What do you think?
Stopping sounds pretty good to me. It's
Okay.
close to my bedtime.
Ah, yeah, right, for me too. I mean, not bedtime, but evening as well. Okay.
Cool. So this is the next one is the last one. Is that right?
I think we have 2 more.
Oh, 2 more. Sorry.
Yeah, so 2 weeks and 4 weeks. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh yeah, I still have to contact the one writer who said he's interested in doing a Q&A with us. So I think I'll write on the issue, like to see which date. I'm not sure if he can do it in the evening, so we'll maybe have to find another time. Okay, so I guess we'll see each other again in 2 weeks. And thanks for joining, and have a nice week.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks, Thomas.
Good chatting to you. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.